The house had always felt calm in a way that did not need silence to exist. It was a small place, but it carried the weight of routine and comfort. Mornings began with light sliding across the porch boards. Afternoons settled into stillness broken only by wind moving through trees at the edge of the street. Nothing about the place asked for attention. That was part of why it felt safe. The porch was narrow, just wide enough for a chair and a small table. It faced the road, which curved gently through the neighborhood like it was trying not to disturb anyone. Most homes looked the same from a distance. Neutral colors, trimmed lawns, driveways kept clear. The sameness was intentional. It was part of the promise sold when people moved in. Order, stability, predictability. That promise came with rules. The HOA governed every visible inch of the neighborhood. Grass height was measured. Paint colors were pre-approved. Decorations were limited by season and size. Nothing loud, nothing bold. Nothing that suggested personal taste beyond what had already been agreed to by a board most residents never saw. For years, that system stayed in the background. Fees were paid. Notices were skimmed. Life continued. The plant arrived on an ordinary afternoon. It was small, barely noticeable, set in a simple clay pot. The kind of plant people pick up without thinking. Green leaves, no flowers, no sharp edges. It was placed near the corner of the porch, tucked beside the railing, where it caught a little sun in the morning and shade by midday. It did not block anything. It did not spill over the edges of the pot. It did not hang or trail or climb. It existed quietly. For several days, nothing happened. Then the letter came. It arrived in a plain envelope with the HOA logo printed in the corner. Those envelopes always felt heavier than they should. Even before opening them, there was a sense of weight. A sense that something had already gone wrong. Inside was a single page. Formal language, cold tone, no greeting, no signature. From a person, just the board. The notice stated that an unapproved item had been placed on the front porch. It cited a specific clause from the community guidelines. Exterior modifications and decorations must receive written approval prior to placement. The fine was modest, but sharp enough to sting. Enough to send a message, enough to remind the recipient who held control. There was no mention of a warning, no grace period, no request for removal. Just a fine effective immediately. The plant was described as a violation. Reading it twice did not make it clearer. Reading it a third time did not make it feel fair. The rules were long, dense, and often vague. Many homes had planters, some had wreaths, others had benches with cushions. Those items had been there for years, but this one plant had crossed a line. The fine was due within 10 days. It would have been easy to remove the plant, pay the fee, and move on. That was what most people did. The HOA relied on that response, compliance through fatigue. Instead, the letter was set down carefully. The rules were retrieved from the filing drawer. The thick packet was spread across the table. Pages were turned slowly. Every section was read, not skimmed, read. The guidelines were detailed, painfully so. Measurements were listed, numbers were exact. Exceptions were buried in footnotes and appendices. Buried among the restrictions was a section about approved porch items. It allowed planters, not one, not two. The language said planters, plural, were allowed as long as they met size limits, color restrictions, and placement guidelines. The pot on the porch met every requirement. It was the right height, the right width, the right material, the right color. It did not obstruct walkways. It did not attach to the structure. It was not seasonal or decorative in nature. It was a plant. The violation was not real. It was assumed. The fine was not about the rules. It was about enforcement. The board had a new president. Everyone knew that. Her name appeared at the top of recent notices. Her tone was different from the previous one. Sharper, more confident, less patient. She believed in visibility, in reminding residents that she was watching. The plant had been seen. That night, the porch light stayed off longer than usual. The plant remained in its place. The letter was not responded to. Not yet. The next morning, the neighborhood looked the same as always. Lawns trimmed, cars parked in driveways, curtains drawn at familiar angles. The illusion of calm remained intact. But something had shifted. The plant was no longer just a plant. It was a line. The rules had been opened, read, and understood. Every allowance had been noted, every limitation memorized. The fine had not ended the issue. It had started something much larger. By the end of the day, a decision had settled into place. It was not driven by anger, it was driven by clarity. If the board wanted strict adherence to the rules, then strict adherence was exactly what they would get. The porch would remain compliant, perfectly compliant. And if the rules allowed planters, then the rules would be followed in full. The plant stayed. The letter was filed, and the space on the porch suddenly felt much bigger than it had the day before. That was where the story truly began. The days after the first fine passed without another letter, but the feeling it left behind did not fade. It lingered in small ways, in the glance toward the porch before leaving the house, in the pause before opening the mailbox, in the awareness that something ordinary had been turned into a problem simply because it could be. The plant remained untouched. Its leaves looked healthier than before, as if the attention had done it some good. It sat exactly where it had been placed, not moved an inch. Nothing about it suggested defiance. That was the part that made the fine feel heavier. It had not disrupted anything. It had simply existed. The HOA rules binder stayed on the table. Each evening, pages were read again. Slower this time. With a pen nearby, margins filled with small notes, page numbers were marked, clauses were cross-referenced. The rules were written to feel absolute, but they were full of openings if someone cared enough to look. The board relied on most people not looking. The section on exterior appearance stretched on for pages. It controlled paint, lighting, furniture, and accessories. It used words like harmonious, consistent, and appropriate, terms that sounded reasonable but meant nothing without enforcement. Then came the measurable parts. Those were different. Numbers left little room for interpretation. Planters were allowed up to a certain height. Pots could be round or square, neutral colors were defined, earth tones were acceptable. Placement could be along railings, walls, or corners, as long as walkways remained clear. There was no limit listed on quantity. That omission felt intentional or careless. Either way, it mattered. Another section addressed plants specifically. It banned invasive species. It restricted vines that could damage structures. It required that plants be maintained and not allowed to die or spill soil. None of it applied to a simple potted plant. The fine had not cited quantity, it had cited approval. That was another area worth reading closely. Approval was required for permanent modifications, for installations, for attachments, for changes to structures. Freestanding items were treated differently. Temporary items were mentioned as well. Seasonal decorations had timelines. Planters were categorized as movable, non-permanent items. Approval was not required for those. The fine had been issued anyway. That told a clear story. The board president had either not read the rules or believed residents would not challenge her interpretation. That belief had likely been correct. Until now. The next step was obvious. Not confrontation, documentation. Photos were taken of the porch from multiple angles. Measurements were recorded. Pot dimensions were written down. The rules were printed with the relevant sections highlighted. Everything was neat, calm, organized. A response letter was drafted, then rewritten, then set aside. There was no rush. Instead, attention shifted to the porch itself. It was a small space, but it met the requirements perfectly. The railing allowed items to be placed along it without blocking entry. The floor had enough width to support multiple pots if they were aligned correctly. Sunlight patterns were observed throughout the day. Morning light hit the left side. Afternoon shade covered the right. It was not ideal for all plants, but it was workable. The idea formed slowly. Not out of spite, out of precision. If the rules allowed planters, then the porch could hold more than one. If placement was the concern, then placement would be flawless. If maintenance was required, then maintenance would be meticulous. The HOA wanted control. Control relied on ambiguity. Removing ambiguity removed their leverage. The first trip to the garden center was quiet. No rush, no dramatic purchases, just walking aisles and reading labels. Sizes were checked, colors compared, neutral tones only, no bright glazes, no patterns. Clay, stone, matte finishes. Plants were chosen with care. Compact growth, clean lines, no flowers that could be labeled decorative. Green foliage only. Varieties that stayed within their containers. Each pot was measured before being placed in the cart. By the time the purchase was complete, the plan was clear. This was not about flooding the porch all at once. That would invite reaction. It would turn the situation into a spectacle too early. This was about following the rules better than the board ever had. The first addition was subtle, a second planter, identical in size and color to the first, placed symmetrically on the other side of the porch. It looked intentional, balanced, improved. No one said anything. Days passed. The mailbox stayed empty. A third planter joined them, smaller, placed along the railing where the rules allowed items under a certain height. It did not block the view. It did not touch the structure. It met every requirement. Still nothing. Neighbors walked by. Some glanced. Most did not. A few slowed their steps slightly, noticing the change without understanding its meaning. The porch still looked clean, calm, intentional. The board did not react because there was nothing obvious to react to. That was the point. Each addition was documented, photos taken, measurements logged, receipts saved, everything aligned with the guidelines. The response letter remained unwritten. It was better this way. By the end of the week, the porch held 6 planters. None of them violated a single rule, and yet the space felt different, fuller, more alive. The quiet tension returned, but this time it carried a sense of anticipation. The board had made the first move. They just did not know the game they had started. The next letter, when it came, would not be unanswered. By the time the 7th planter was placed, the porch no longer looked like an afterthought. It looked designed. Every pot aligned with intention. Spacing was exact. Nothing touched, nothing crowded. The walkway remained open, measured twice, to be sure. From the street, it still appeared restrained. Clean lines, neutral tones, no flowers, no color that could be accused of decoration rather than maintenance. It looked like something lifted straight from an HOA brochure about acceptable personalization. That was not accidental. Each morning began with inspection. Soil checked, leaves wiped free of dust. Any stray growth trimmed back before it crossed a line that did not exist but could be imagined. Watering was done early, so no damp marks remained by the time anyone might notice. Perfect compliance required effort. The rules did not demand excellence. They demanded obedience. But excellence made obedience undeniable. The first sign of attention came in the form of a slow-moving vehicle. It was an HOA board member's car, easily recognized by the way it crawled through the neighborhood rather than driving. It paused briefly in front of the house, not long enough to be obvious. Just long enough to count. No note followed. That afternoon, the rules binder came out again. The section on quantity was read a third time. Nothing, no limit, no maximum, no language suggesting discretion. Just size, placement, and maintenance. Section about clutter was considered, then dismissed. Clutter was defined as disorganized, excessive, or obstructive. None of those applied. The plan continued. The next additions were smaller pots, placed along the inner corners of the porch where they framed the space rather than filling it. The number rose to 12. The effect was subtle but undeniable. The porch no longer looked like a blank slate. It looked lived in. Neighbors began to notice. One paused longer than necessary while walking a dog. Another slowed their car when passing. There were no comments, no questions. Just looks that lingered. That silence carried meaning. The HOA thrived on quiet compliance, not quiet observation. When people noticed rules being followed creatively, it disrupted the balance. A week passed. Then the second letter arrived. This one was longer, less confident. It referenced general community standards rather than specific clauses. It suggested that the number of planters may be considered excessive, maybe. That phrase mattered. No fine was included, no deadline. Just a reminder to maintain the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. It was not signed. The letter was placed beside the first. The response, when written, was brief. It acknowledged receipt. It cited the exact sections of the guidelines related to planters. It included photos, measurements, page numbers. It stated clearly that all items were compliant, no emotion, no argument, just facts. The letter was sent. Then the planting continued. The next wave was more deliberate. Larger pots were added, still within size limits, placed at the far ends of the porch to anchor the space. They were heavy, solid, immovable without effort. They made a statement without breaking a rule. The count rose to 20. At that point, the porch had reached its comfortable capacity. Not crowded, not cluttered, just full and still compliant. The board reacted with silence. That silence was not acceptance. It was calculation. The HOA president was not used to being challenged this way. She was used to residents backing down, apologizing or arguing emotionally. This was different. This was methodical. The third letter took longer to arrive. When it did, it was addressed personally. It requested a meeting. The request was declined. Not refused. Declined. The response stated that all concerns could be addressed in writing and that all current items were compliant under existing guidelines. Again, facts. Calm. No tone to react to. The porch gained 4 more planters the next day. Smaller ones, lined neatly along the railing, spaced evenly. The count reached 24. From a distance, it looked like a garden display. From up close, it looked like a compliance checklist brought to life. The neighborhood began to whisper, not loudly, not openly, but questions were asked quietly. Who? It proved that. Is that allowed? Why does it look kind of nice? Those questions were dangerous to the board. Rules only worked when people believed they were fragile, when they believed pushing them would cause trouble. Here, the rules were holding. Steady, another slow drive-by, another pause, another count. No letter followed. Instead, a general community email was sent. It reminded residents to seek approval before making changes. It did not mention planters. It did not mention the porch. It was vague by design. That vagueness was another admission. They could not act without exposing their own inconsistency. The porch did not change. It stayed clean, maintained, alive. The number climbed slowly over the next 2 weeks. 30, 35, 40. Each addition followed the same pattern. Measure. Place. Document. Maintain. The porch was no longer just compliant. It was an example, and examples are dangerous in controlled environments. By the time the count reached 42, the board was no longer quiet. The next move would not be subtle, and neither would the response. 42 planters changed the way the porch was seen. It was no longer something people noticed in passing. It became a landmark, not because it was loud or messy, but because it existed in direct contrast to everything around it. The rest of the neighborhood remained sparse by design, 1 or 2 pots at most. A wreath during the holidays, a chair that looked like it came from the same catalog as every other chair on the street. The porch, by comparison, felt intentional in a way the rules had never planned for. It still followed them. That was the problem. The HOA president did not send another letter right away. Instead, she tried a different approach, one that relied on pressure rather than policy. The community newsletter featured a new section about curb appeal. It talked about balance, restraint, visual harmony. There were no names mentioned, but there did not need to be. Everyone knew. The article included stock photos of minimalist porches, clean, bare, approved. The porch with 42 planters did not resemble those images at all, and yet it did not violate a single line of text beneath them. The board hoped social pressure would succeed where enforcement had failed. It did not. The plants were maintained more carefully than ever. Leaves were trimmed, soil refreshed. Any sign of decay was handled immediately. There was no clutter, no overgrowth, nothing that could be used as leverage. Neighbors began stopping, not openly, not at first, but pauses turned into quiet comments. Compliments slipped into conversation. Someone asked what kind of plants they were. Someone else asked if the HOA really allowed that many. The answer was always the same. The rules do. That sentence spread faster than any email the board could send. Once people started reading the guidelines for themselves, things shifted. A few porches gained a second planter, then a third. Small changes. Safe changes. But changes, all the same, the HOA president noticed. The next notice arrived as a violation warning. It claimed that the number of planters created a visual distraction inconsistent with community standards. No fine yet. Just a warning. The response was immediate this time. It requested clarification. It asked which specific guideline was being violated. It included a list of relevant sections that allowed planters. It asked for written confirmation of the standard being applied. No emotion, no sarcasm, just a paper trail. The board did not respond. Instead, the next HOA meeting agenda included a new item: review of exterior decor guidelines. That was the real move. Changing the rules was the only way out. But rule changes took time. Notice, periods, votes, approval thresholds. The process existed to protect residents, even if the board rarely expected to be challenged on it. The porch gained 3 more planters that week, 45. The placement was tighter now, but still compliant. The porch was nearly full, yet still navigable. Each pot had a purpose, each gap was measured. It was a living interpretation of the rulebook. The day of the HOA meeting came. Attendance was higher than usual. People were curious, not angry, curious. The discussion stayed general. The board spoke about maintaining community character, about preventing extremes. About future considerations, nothing passed. The porch remained. After the meeting, the HOA president walked the street herself. Slowly, stopping, looking. She stood in front of the house longer than anyone else ever had. No note was left. The next week brought another community email. This one asked for feedback on potential updates to decor policies. It was framed as collaboration. It was not. Responses flooded in. Some supported tighter rules. Most did not. Many referenced the porch. Some defended it openly. They liked it. It was neat. It was maintained. It was still within the rules. That kind of public support was unexpected. The board had miscalculated. They assumed annoyance would spread faster than appreciation. It did not. The porch gained 2 more planters, 47. At that point, the board was boxed in. They could not fine without citing a rule. They could not change the rule without appearing reactionary. They could not single out one house without exposing inconsistency. The president had made the original fine personal. Now it was political. The neighborhood was watching. The next move would decide whether the board retained authority or lost it, and the porch was not finished yet. By the time the count reached 47, the porch had stopped feeling like a private space. It had become a symbol, even if no one used that word out loud. People did not need to say it. They showed it in how often they slowed down when passing, in how often they glanced twice, in how conversations shifted when the HOA came up. The board felt it too. Authority works best when it feels invisible. When people follow rules without thinking about who wrote them. The moment attention turns toward the rule-makers themselves, control weakens. The HOA president had crossed that line with the first fine. Now she was trapped on the wrong side of it. Another letter arrived, this one thicker than the rest. It did not include a fine. It did not include a warning. Instead, it included language about community spirit and shared responsibility. It suggested a voluntary reduction in the number of planters to restore visual balance. Voluntary. That word carried more weight than any threat. Voluntary meant they could not force it. The response acknowledged the suggestion and declined it politely. It restated compliance. It thanked the board for their time, nothing more. The letter was filed. The porch gained 3 more planters the following weekend. 50. That number mattered, even if the rules did not recognize it. 50 planters turned curiosity into certainty. This was no longer accidental. It was intentional, careful, controlled, and still compliant. The board tried a new angle. A maintenance notice was issued, reminding residents that all exterior items must be kept in good condition. It was generic. It applied to everyone, but inspectors appeared the next morning anyway. They walked the street with clipboards. They checked gutters. They looked at fences. They measured grass. When they reached the porch, they slowed. They examined each pot. They noted spacing. They looked for cracks, stains, dead leaves. They found none. Everything was clean. Everything was maintained. They left without comment. That silence was louder than any fine. Behind the scenes, the board argued. Some wanted to let it go. Others wanted to rewrite the rules immediately. A few worried about setting a precedent. The president wanted control back, but control requires a lever, and there was none. The porch gained 2 more planters that week. 52. Neighbors started asking questions more openly now, not in whispers, not behind closed doors. They asked, in driveways, on sidewalks, at mailboxes, is that really allowed? Yes, did they fine you? They tried. What happened? Nothing. That last word unsettled people more than a fight ever could. Nothing meant the system had failed quietly. A few residents submitted their own requests for small changes, extra parts, slightly different placements, things they had avoided before out of fear. The board approved some, delayed others, denied. A view without explanation. That inconsistency did not go unnoticed. The porch gained 1 more planter, 53. At that point, the space was full, truly full, not crowded, but complete. Every allowed inch held something green. The porch looked less like a porch and more like a controlled experiment in rule following. The effect was striking. It did not look rebellious. It looked calm, orderly, thought out. That was what frustrated the board most. There was no chaos to point at, no mess to clean up, no violation to photograph, only compliance taken to its logical end. The next HOA meeting was tense. Attendance was even higher than before. People had opinions now. Some spoke, others listened closely. The board tried to steer the conversation toward general updates. It did not work. Someone asked directly about the porch. The president responded carefully. She said the situation was under review. She said the board was considering updates to clarify expectations. Clarify, that word landed poorly. Clarify suggested the rules were unclear, and if they were unclear, then fines issued under them were questionable. No one said that out loud, but everyone heard it. After the meeting, the board announced a special session to discuss guideline revisions. That announcement was meant to reassert control. Instead, it exposed weakness. The porch did not change. It remained perfect. Days passed, then weeks. No new letters came. The board was stalled. They could not move forward without admitting the past had been mishandled. They could not move backward without losing authority. The president stopped driving past the house. That absence was noticed too. The porch gained no more planters. It did not need to. The point had been made. The rules had been followed so completely that they had collapsed under their own weight. And now, the board had to decide whether to fix the rules or live with what they had allowed. Either choice would cost them something. The quiet before the decision stretched on, and everyone waited to see which way it would break. The waiting was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Not because something loud was about to happen, but because nothing was happening at all. The porch stayed exactly as it was. 53 planters. Clean. Balanced. Alive. Silence is easy when control feels secure. It becomes unbearable when control is slipping. The HOA board felt that shift. Emails slowed, notices stopped. Even routine reminders were delayed. The machinery of enforcement hesitated, unsure which lever could still be pulled without snapping in full view of the neighborhood. Residents noticed the change. People who once avoided any interaction with the board began asking questions. Not confrontational ones. Simple ones. Requests that had always been denied before were suddenly approved, or at least answered with something other than silence. The board had become cautious. The porch had not broken the rules, it had exposed them. Every rule exists with an assumption. that it will be used sparingly, that no one will push it to the edge, that compliance will stay comfortably below the E line. Once someone stands exactly on that line and refuses to step back, the rule stops feeling solid. It starts to feel fragile. The president tried one last quiet move. A courtesy inspection notice was sent, informing residents that a general A review of exterior items would take place over the next 2 weeks. No reason given, no specific concern cited. It sounded routine. It was not. Inspectors returned, this time with cameras. They documented everything: pots, railings, walkways. They measured distances again, even though they already had the numbers. When they reached the porch, they took more photos than anywhere else on the street. Still, they found nothing. No obstruction, no damage, no decay. The report came back clean. That report mattered more than any letter. It meant the board's own process had confirmed compliance. Any further action would contradict their own documentation. The porch had become untouchable. Word spread faster after that. Not in gossip, but in confidence. People felt safer pushing back, safer asking for clarity, safer saying no. One resident challenged a fine over a trash bin placement and won. Another questioned a warning about window coverings and had it withdrawn. The board stopped issuing fines altogether for a while. They called it a review period. Everyone else called it hesitation. The HOA president lost her edge. She spoke less in meetings. When she did speak, her tone softened. She emphasized cooperation instead of authority. That shift did not restore control. It confirmed its loss. The porch stayed perfect. Maintenance continued daily. Leaves trimmed, soil refreshed. Pots rotated slightly to ensure even light. No plant grew wild. No pot cracked or stained. If the board was waiting for decay, it did not come. The special session on guideline revisions was eventually held. Attendance was high. The proposed changes were narrow. They introduced a maximum number of planters per porch. They added language about board discretion. They framed it as clarification, rather than restriction. Residents read the proposal carefully. They saw what it was. A reaction. People spoke up, calmly, clearly. They asked why a limit was suddenly necessary. They asked why discretion was being expanded instead of rules being respected as written. They asked why fines had been issued before the rules were clarified. Those questions had no comfortable answers. The board postponed the vote. Again. That postponement was the final admission. They could not fix the rules without admitting they had misused them. The porch did not change. It did not need to. By now the message was clear. The board could enforce rules only when people accepted their interpretation without reading for themselves. That era was over. The HOA president missed a meeting for the first time since taking office. Then she missed another. A notice went out announcing that she would be stepping back temporarily due to personal reasons. No one asked what those reasons were. The vice president took over meetings. He spoke carefully. He avoided controversy. He emphasized stability. The porch remained. 53 planters. Quiet. Orderly. Alive. The board stopped mentioning it altogether, not because it had, been resolved, but because acknowledging it meant acknowledging defeat. The neighborhood settled into a new kind of quiet. One built on awareness rather than fear. Rules still existed. They just no longer ruled. And the porch stood as a reminder that control, once questioned, rarely returns in the same form. What came next would make that loss permanent. Chapter 6. When Rules Lose Their Grip. The waiting settled in like a thick fog. Not dramatic, not loud, just heavy. The porch stayed exactly as it was. 53 planters arranged with care, clean lines. Green life filling every allowed inch. Nothing changed because nothing needed to. Silence is easy when authority feels secure. It becomes unbearable when that authority starts slipping. The HOA board felt it. Emails slowed, routine notices stopped showing up. Even the usual reminders about trash bins and lawn edges arrived late or not at all. The system hesitated, unsure, which lever could still be pulled without breaking something in plain view. Residents noticed. People who once avoided the board began asking questions, simple ones, polite ones. Requests that used to be denied automatically were now approved, or at least answered. The board had become cautious. The porch had not broken the rules. It had exposed them. Every rule exists with an assumption that no one will push it all the way, that compliance will stay comfortably below the line, that people will follow without testing the edges. Once someone stands exactly on that edge and refuses to move, the rule stops feeling solid. It starts to feel thin. The HOA president made one last quiet attempt to regain ground. A courtesy inspection notice went out, informing residents of a general exterior review scheduled over the next 2 weeks. No reason was given, no specific concern was listed. It sounded routine. It was not. Inspectors returned with clipboards and cameras. They walked slowly. They measured. They photographed. Gutters, fences, driveways, porch railings. When they reached the house with the plants, they took their time. They examined each pot, checked spacing, looked for cracks, stains, dead leaves, anything that could be used later. There was nothing. Every planter was clean, every plant healthy, walkways clear. The inspection report came back clean. That mattered more than any letter. It meant the board's own process had confirmed full compliance. Any future action would contradict their own documentation. The porch had become untouchable. After that, something shifted across the neighborhood. Word spread, not as gossip, but as confidence. People felt safer pushing back, safer asking for clarity, safer saying no when something felt wrong. One resident challenged a fine over trash bin placement and won. Another questioned a warning about window coverings and had it withdrawn. A third asked for written clarification on a landscaping rule and got it. The board stopped issuing fines, altogether for a stretch. They called it a review period. Everyone else called it hesitation. The HOA president lost her sharpness. She spoke less in meetings. When she did speak, her tone was softer. She talked about cooperation instead of enforcement, community instead of compliance. That shift did not restore control. It confirmed its loss. The porch stayed perfect. Maintenance continued daily, leaves trimmed, soil refreshed. Pots rotated slightly for even light. No plant was allowed to grow wild, no pot cracked or stained. If the board was waiting for decay, it never came. The special session on guideline revisions was eventually held. Attendance was high. The proposed changes were narrow but revealing. A maximum number of planters per porch, expanded language about board discretion, framed as clarification, not restriction. Residents read carefully. They saw exactly what it was. A reaction. People spoke calmly, clearly. They asked why a limit was suddenly needed, why discretion was being expanded instead of rules being followed as written, why fines had been issued before any clarification existed. Those questions had no safe answers. The board postponed the vote, then postponed it again. That delay was the final admission. They could not fix the rules without admitting they had misused them. The porch did not change. It did not have to. By now the lesson was clear. The board's power only worked when people accepted interpretations without reading for themselves. Once that trust broke, enforcement became fragile. The HOA president missed a meeting for the first time since taking office. Then she missed another. A notice went out stating she would be stepping back temporarily for personal reasons. No one asked what those reasons were. The vice president took over meetings. He spoke carefully, avoided controversy, focused on stability. The porch remained 53 planters, quiet, orderly, alive. The board stopped mentioning it altogether, not because it was resolved, but because acknowledging it meant admitting defeat. The neighborhood settled into a new kind of quiet, one built on awareness instead of fear. Rules still existed, they just no longer ruled. And the porch stood as proof that once authority is questioned and survives the test, it never returns in the same shape. What came next would make that change permanent. The quiet that followed did not feel temporary. It felt settled, like a new normal forming slowly, without announcement. The porch stayed the same, 53 planters in careful order, green and calm. No movement except leaves shifting in the way. Wind. It no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like part of the landscape. That was the final shift. When something stops feeling like a threat, it starts feeling like truth. The HOA board tried to move forward as if nothing had happened. Agendas. Return to routine items. Meetings were shorter, emails were carefully worded, the vice president avoided strong language. He emphasized consistency, fairness, and process. Those words sounded different now. Residents listened differently. They read more. They asked for written answers. They quoted sections of the rules back to the board, not aggressively, casually, the way people do when they know they are standing on solid ground. The porch had taught them how. The proposed guideline changes never came back for a vote. Each time they were mentioned, someone asked for justification. Someone else asked for data. Another asked why enforcement had started before clarity. The questions piled up. The board stopped trying. Instead, resignations began. First, a member announced they would not be renewing their term. They cited time constraints. Then another followed, offering a similar explanation. No one challenged them. No one needed to. The board was shrinking. The HOA president remained absent. Her temporary step back stretched longer. Eventually, a brief announcement confirmed her resignation. No statement, no apology. Just a notice. The reaction was muted. People had already moved on. A new election was scheduled. Turnout was higher than anyone expected. Residents who had never shown interest before submitted their names. They talked openly about transparency, about sticking to written rules, about not using fines as first responses. They did not mention the porch. They did not need to. The porch was understood. The election changed the board completely. Only one previous member remained, and even he sounded different, more careful, less certain. The new board's first act was small but telling. They issued a community message acknowledging that past enforcement had caused frustration. They committed to clearer communication and fair application of rules. They encouraged residents to read the guidelines and ask questions. No fines were mentioned. The porch stayed exactly as it was. No one asked for its removal. No one suggested change. It had outlasted the conflict. Neighbors stopped slowing down when they passed. The plants became familiar, normal. Children brushed leaves with their hands on the way by. Delivery drivers stepped carefully around the pots without thinking about why they were there. Normal is powerful. It strips meaning from conflict. The new board reviewed all pending violations and quietly dismissed most of them. They rewrote internal procedures, not the rules themselves. Warnings replaced fines. Conversations replaced notices. Control shifted into something closer to management. The porch never entered those discussions. It did not need protection anymore. It was protected by precedent. The HOA had learned the hardest lesson. Any authority can learn. Once someone proves the rules can be followed without surrender, fear stops working. Compliance without fear looks very different. It looks confident. The season changed. Some plants were replaced with hardier ones, still within guidelines, still documented, still perfect. The number stayed the same, 53. No more. No less. The porch had reached its final form. The story of the fine faded into memory, passed, along casually to new residents as a strange thing that happened once. Not a warning, a lesson. The HOA never issued another fine for planters again. They did not need to. Everyone knew where the line really was now, and that line had been drawn, not by rebellion, but by perfect, patient compliance. The final chapter did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, just like the plant that started it all. Years later, it was difficult to remember the neighborhood as it had been before the plant. Not because the past was erased, but because the present felt more honest. The streets still looked orderly, lawns were still trimmed, porches were still calm. But something underneath had shifted, and it never shifted back. The porch remained, 53 planters. No more, no less. They were not all the same anymore. Some had been replaced over time as seasons changed and plants reached the end of their natural lives. Each replacement followed the same process that had always been used. Measure, verify, place, maintain. The rules were still respected, but they no longer felt heavy. The porch was no longer watched. That was the clearest sign that everything had changed. The new HOA board settled into a routine that felt almost boring, and that was exactly what people wanted. Meetings were shorter, agendas were clear. Decisions were documented and shared without drama. Enforcement focused on safety issues and actual neglect, not personal taste or technicalities. Fines became rare. When they did happen, they came with explanations, warnings, and time to correct issues. People responded differently to that approach. Not with resentment, but with cooperation. Fear had been replaced by trust. New residents moved in without knowing the full story. They noticed the porch, of course. Everyone did. But to them, it was just part of the neighborhood. A house with a lot of plants, nicely kept, pleasant. Sometimes they asked if it was allowed. The answer was always simple. Yes, it is. That answer carried no tension anymore. No edge, just fact. The story behind it was shared only when someone really wanted to hear it. Usually in quiet moments, at a mailbox, while walking a dog, sitting on a low wall in the evening. It was told calmly, without pride, without bitterness. It always ended the same way. The rules allowed it. So it stayed. The HOA never tried to rewrite the planter section again. They learned that reacting to one situation only created another. Instead, they focused on clarity going forward. When rules were unclear, they clarified them before enforcement. When someone asked a question, they answered it in writing. That approach spread. People started reading everything more closely, not to fight, but to understand. Knowledge stopped being something the board held alone. It belonged to everyone now. The porch became something like a reference point. Not officially, just quietly. When someone asked how far they could go without crossing a line, someone else would smile and say they could always check the porch. That smile mattered. It meant the rules were no longer mysterious. Time softened the edges of the conflict until it barely felt like a conflict at all. The first fine letter yellowed in a folder. The response letters gathered dust. The binder stayed on a shelf instead of the table. Life moved on, but the effect did not fade. Other small changes followed over the years. A resident challenged a noise, warning that had been issued unfairly. Another pushed back on a parking rule that had been applied inconsistently. Each time, the board responded with care instead of force. They had learned what force cost. The original HOA president was rarely mentioned anymore. When she was, it was without anger. Just as part of the story, a reminder of how quickly authority can overreach when it forgets its purpose. The porch never became a tourist attraction. It never made the news. It never went viral on its own, and yet it did something far more lasting. It changed behavior. Children grew up in the neighborhood, watching adults stand their ground calmly. They learned that rules mattered, but so did fairness. They learned that reading was a form of power, that patience could be louder than shouting. Those lessons lingered. On quiet mornings, the porch looked almost peaceful enough to forget why it existed at all. Sunlight filtered through leaves. Shadows fell across the boards. The plants moved gently with the breeze. It looked like a place meant to be enjoyed, not defended. That was the final victory. Not the number of planters, not the resignation, not the silence of the board. The victory was that the porch no longer felt like a statement. It was just home again. The rules still existed. They always would. But they had been stripped of their sharpest edge. They served the community instead of controlling it, all because of one small plant. Placed quietly, maintained carefully, never moved. The HOA fined it once. They never tried again, and the neighborhood never forgot why.